It was the third summer solstice of a war that had already swallowed tens of millions. As dawn broke over the Eastern Front on June 22, 1944, the sun cast its golden hue over the trenches and minefields that cut across Belarus like infected wounds. To the men of Germany's 9th Corps stationed near Vitebsk, it was a quiet morning. Too quiet. They believed the storm had passed, that the Soviets were too battered, too focused elsewhere to mount another major attack. But history, like nature, despises complacency. What if that silence wasn't peace, but the inhale before a scream? What if the German army's greatest defeat didn't come at Stalingrad, but in the forests and fields of Belarus, at the hands of an enemy who mastered the art of deception? 3 years earlier, on this very day, Hitler had launched Operation Barbarossa, the titanic invasion of the Soviet Union. It was to be his war of annihilation, a campaign to crush Bolshevism, seize Lebensraum, and bring the Slavic East under the heel of the Reich. At first, it worked. The Wehrmacht surged across the steppes, shattering divisions, encircling cities, and reaching the gates of Moscow. But then came winter, then came Stalingrad, then came Kursk. By mid-1944, the tide had turned. Soviet counteroffensives were now relentless, coordinated, and increasingly modern. The Battle of Kursk, fought and lost by Germany in the summer of 1943, had drained the last offensive breath from Hitler's eastern campaign. In its aftermath, the Red Army surged westward, reclaiming over 800 kilometers of territory by February 1944. Yet for all these Soviet gains, the Germans still held a precarious but stubborn line in Belarus, manned by Army Group Center, Hitler's most strategically positioned and symbolically vital force on the Eastern Front. And this is where Soviet high command saw opportunity, not in the south, where oil fields and flanking threats had long consumed German attention, but in the heart of Belarus. What the Wehrmacht thought was stable ground was in truth a crumbling facade. This would not be another frontal assault. This would be the Soviet Union's masterstroke, Operation Bagration. Named after a Russian prince who died fighting Napoleon, Operation Bagration was more than a military campaign, it was a revenge symphony. The Soviets didn't just want to advance, they wanted to obliterate. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Konstantin Rokossovsky understood that to do so, they needed something the Soviets rarely enjoyed: total surprise. And so began Maskirovka, the grand deception. While German intelligence fixated on troop movements in Ukraine, where another offensive was indeed underway, the real storm was building in the north. Troops were shuttled to Belarus only at night. Tanks rolled out during the day, in reverse. Dummy units, radio silence, fake maps, misinformation, a web so intricate, it fooled even Hitler's most paranoid commanders. By June 1944, over 1.6 million Soviet soldiers, backed by 32,000 artillery pieces, 5,800 tanks, and 7,800 aircraft, had silently amassed along the Belarusian front. Supporting them were partisan sabotage units, locals who knew every rail line, every supply depot, every vulnerability. In contrast, Army Group Center was hollow. Stripped of reserves to support the South, and clinging to outdated defensive doctrines, its 800,000 soldiers and paltry tank forces were backed not by flexibility, but Hitler's obsessive, no retreat, orders. Then came the blow. At 5 a.m. on June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, the earth erupted. Soviet artillery thundered across a 700-kilometer front, turning German trench lines into pulp. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, Minsk. One by one, these critical cities would become death traps. The first domino fell at Vitebsk. Trapped by a double pincer maneuver, the German 53rd Corps pleaded for evacuation. High command refused. By June 25, they were surrounded. By June 27, they ceased to exist, 30,000 men dead or captured. To the south, Rokossovsky struck Bobruisk with surgical brutality. German armor, attempting to redeploy, sank in Belarus's treacherous marshlands. Their mechanical lifelines mired and broken, they became targets for Soviet bombers. Bobruisk fell, Mogilev followed. And still, the assault pressed on, relentless and coordinated. It was the Soviet concept of deep battle, fully realized. Not just to breach a line, but to collapse an entire front, to decapitate its leadership, shatter its cohesion, and render it incapable of regrouping. By July 3, the twin pincers had closed around Minsk, where 100,000 German soldiers were trapped. The Red Army's tank corps poured through the last defenses. Within 48 hours, the city was in Soviet hands. Most of the trapped divisions would never escape. Among the captured was Lieutenant General Vincenz Muller, commander of the 4th Army, who surrendered the survivors on July 8. In less than 3 weeks, Army Group Center, the core of German strength in the east, had been annihilated. When news of the destruction reached Berlin, even the most ardent Nazi propagandists couldn't conceal the scale of the disaster. 25 German divisions had been wiped off the map. Nearly 300,000 soldiers had been killed or captured, many of them veterans from the earliest campaigns in the East. Thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft had been destroyed or abandoned in forests now teeming with Soviet partisans and advancing infantry. For the German war machine, Operation Bagration wasn't just a defeat, it was a hemorrhage. Unlike Stalingrad, which was fought in bitter winter and remembered for its symbolism, the loss in Belarus was surgical, complete, and far more devastating in military terms. Army Group Center had been reduced from a pillar of the Wehrmacht to a shattered relic. The Eastern Front was no longer a front. It was a rout, and the Soviets knew it. After Minsk, the Red Army didn't slow down. Their next objective, cut off Army Group North. While Rokossovsky and Zhukov pushed west into Poland, the First Baltic Front swept north toward the Lithuanian city of Charliai. The speed of their advance was shocking, a brutal contrast to the slog of previous years. By July 27, Charliai had fallen. 4 days later, Soviet forces reached the Gulf of Riga, severing land contact between Army Group North and the rest of the German Eastern Front. Army Group North, still numbering hundreds of thousands, was now marooned in the Baltics, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and even retreat. They would remain isolated for the rest of the war. At the same time, Soviet columns advanced into northern Poland, capturing Vilnius and Białystok in a matter of weeks. To the south, another offensive crashed through Ukraine, forcing Romania and Bulgaria to defect from the Axis. The dominoes were falling faster than anyone, even Stalin, had anticipated. But it was in Warsaw where the most haunting consequence of Operation Bagration unfolded. The Polish capital, brutalized under Nazi occupation, now saw Soviet forces approaching from the east. Believing liberation was at hand, the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising on August 1, 1944. Between 20,000 and 50,000 resistance fighters rose up against the occupying garrison, igniting street battles across the city. For days, they held their ground. Weeks passed, the fighting grew bloodier, but the Red Army, already exhausted from its advance, paused at the Vistula River. Whether due to legitimate logistical strain or cold political calculus, some historians believe Stalin let the uprising burn, Soviet forces did not intervene. And so Warsaw was left to bleed. German reinforcements, redeployed from Italy and the Western Front, crushed the revolt. By October, the city was a smoldering ruin. Over 150,000 Poles were dead, and the capital was left in ashes. This was one of the darkest ironies of Operation Bagration. The momentum that freed Belarus and devastated the Wehrmacht could not, or would not, save Warsaw. By August 19, the Soviet offensive finally came to a halt. Not because of German resistance, but because of its own success. 550 kilometers of territory had been recaptured. Over 500,000 Red Army soldiers were wounded or sick. More than 180,000 had been killed. But they had done what Napoleon could not. What even Stalin hadn't dreamed possible. They had broken the backbone of the Nazi Empire in the East. Germany would never recover. Its forces were now split, outnumbered, and demoralized. It would spend the rest of the war retreating, fighting desperate holding actions as the Red Army thundered toward Berlin. And yet, in Moscow, where Stalin celebrated the triumph with a macabre echo of ancient Rome, 57,000 German prisoners were paraded through Red Square. A triumph not of honor, but of retribution. A reminder that the war was not yet over, and that revenge, once set in motion, is hard to stop. But perhaps the most haunting question left by Operation Bagration is this: how did the German High Command, once so feared for its precision, become so blind? Was it arrogance, deception, or simply the decay of a regime built on fantasy? And if such a mighty force could fall so swiftly, so absolutely, what does that say about the true nature of power? After all, empires don't just fall, they rot, and one morning, they collapse. This has been Legacy Files. If you found this story haunting, sobering, or revealing, consider subscribing. There are many more legacies to uncover.